Hello, and welcome to the All Things Narrative podcast, where we explore the relationships between the stories we love and the stories we live. I'm your host, Derek Hatch, and let's get started. Welcome back to Narrative 101. Thank you for joining us on this second Tuesday of the month. And our previous Narrative 101 explored the narrative metaphor, which was our foundation, because without that, we can't really have anywhere else to go. So the narrative metaphor, just as a quick review, but I encourage you to go check out the whole episode, is that we tell stories to make sense of life and ultimately to make meaning. It's this use of story language that we use externally and internally that we go off of, and we begin to think of our lives as a story. And if we use this metaphor of story, how does that impact the way that we move in the world? How does that impact the way we see ourselves and our relationships with others? So that's what these Narrative 101 episodes are really about, is talking about how that happens and how the world of narrative practices intersects with the narratives in fiction and beyond. So yeah, we are going through these different principles, and these are the same principles for my company, All Things Narrative. And if you want to learn more about what the rest of them are, you could either go to allthingsnarrative.com, or you could just tune in every second Tuesday, because we're doing a different one for these first 6 months. So here we go. Our second one here. Woo, this is a fun one. This is one that will definitely get conversation going with people. And it's people are not their problems. Agree or disagree. Like or dislike. Now, you probably have a lot of ideas that come into your head when you hear that statement, and rightfully so. So I want to encourage you to be open-minded as we explore this idea here of people not being their problems. So where does that come from, that idea? Well, as you'll see, it's a very old idea, but in terms of narrative practices, so Michael White and David Epstein, in their book Narrative Means to Therapeutic Ends, that came out in 1990 at the genesis of all this, they came out with just a very simple but elegant statement. The person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. Now, why would they say that? Because, if you're in therapy and you're helping people with their problems, therapists trying to dig down, into the core of who you are and figure out what's there, that's the problem, that's internal and all that stuff. Isn't that what we would expect, right? Surface actions are a result of what's going on underneath in you. But narrative practices takes a different approach to problems, to where we see problems not in isolation from what's going on around a person. So here's what I mean by that. We try to recognize that problems exist within a context. That context includes the society and culture that someone is raised in. That includes the narratives within that society and culture that perpetuates certain ideas of what is good and what is not good. That includes the narratives that they're influenced by, narratives that maybe come from their family, narratives that come from beliefs that they hold, narratives that come from the media and the entertainment that they consume, narratives that come from religious traditions. All these narratives inform a person, and they shape our ideas of what's good and what's not good. Now, what happens is that there are narratives that come into our lives that do something within us. You look at an addiction, and you look at somebody who can't stop drinking, or somebody who gets hooked on drugs. Where does that come from? Well, that gets introduced. Genetically, they might have been predisposed to where it might have been, more likely for them to get addicted. But the reality is somebody had to come along and give them that first drink, that first hit, whatever it is. Somebody came and something came out of that and influenced the person and the course of their life. this is what's called like externalizing problems. So we move from the place where we see problems as residing innately within a person, or even saying that the person is the problem, but we recognize that problems affect us and that they are external in nature. Now, this isn't to downplay people's experiences or the perception that we have that problems are internal, because we do experience problems on an internal level. We experience them in the battles of our minds and our hearts and all that stuff. But we try to provide a way in narrative practices of dealing with problems that can ultimately give a person more agency. Because a lot of the time what we find is that if the person sees themselves as the problem, that doesn't give them a lot of hope in how to deal with it. Because it's like, oh, well, I'm stuck with me. And there's other things about identity that's attached to that'll be our next Narrative 101 in May. But talking about this idea of people not being their problems, one of the pushbacks that you might have when you hear that is, but how do people take responsibility for their actions if they're not the problem? Well, what's interesting is this actually is a way of taking responsibility, because this doesn't mean that people aren't supposed to do something about their problems, but it's more in how do we deal with problems. So understanding our relationship with problems and the ways they contribute to our lives. So Michael White puts it really well when he says, quote, "If a person's relationship with the problem becomes more clearly defined, as it does in externalizing conversations, a range of possibilities become available to revise this relationship." How many people have you met, or maybe this is you yourself, that sit there and you look at yourself and you just feel like, well, this is just who I am. I am the problem. And there's ramifications of that. There's a feeling of hopelessness, a spirit of hopelessness that can come over us when we begin to see ourselves this way. This distinction is helpful because I want people to recognize that there are consequences for their actions, but their actions are being influenced by people and narratives and different things. So what does it look like to kind of renegotiate a relationship with a problem? Well, one of the things we do in my workshops is we write a letter to the problem. So we kind of externalize what the problem is. We take some time to address it. So for example, let's say that somebody comes into my workshop or on one-on-one coaching and they say, I've been clinically diagnosed with anxiety, bipolar disorder, depression, etc. Or they say, oh, I am just an anxious person, or I am an addict. And you hear that. Those are identity statements that you're making. So the way I might engage back with you is I might kind of begin to talk about that problem in the third person. So I might say, for example, what are some ways that the anxiety provokes you during the day? When is the anxiety most prevalent? Where does the anxiety most show up? And I might ask questions about, what does this problem sound like? What does it tell you? What does it look like? I might ask you to draw it. Or in the case of writing a letter, how do we kind of renegotiate our relationship with that? Fear's a good one that always gets brought up a lot in my work. And there's actually positives about fear, believe it or not. Fear can keep us from doing really stupid things. Fear can keep us from breaking the law and, murdering somebody and thinking we could get away with it. So there is a healthy idea of fear that's good for us as people. But so there is a way that fear can cripple us as well, that can hold us back from making important decisions in life and taking action. So when we write a letter to the fear, we might renegotiate that relationship where maybe the fear is the one who has control right now. And we're here to say, no, you're done. Maybe the fear is something that we banish it somewhere and we call it out when we need it, but we don't let it control us. So we might write a letter to that fear. And so another way that we might be able to better understand externalizing problems is through the arts. Think of like in theater and in drama. I've taught drama and theater before, and one of the exercises that's really interesting to do is to try to create a character out of a problem that a person is facing. So I did this exercise with students one time where I had them create a problem that the student was facing, a real problem that they were facing in their lives. And I would try to have other students act out the problem, and I would allow the student who came up with that problem to kind of direct them of like, oh, the problem is it has more of like a growl to its voice, or the problem is kind of sneaky the way it moves around. It's not quick. And just being able to, have a student engage with a problem in that way. It's a great example of this that was developed by Yvonne Sleep. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. But this was in the 90s in the village of Malawi. And she wanted to try to find a way to educate the village about AIDS. And so they put on a play in the village where they had somebody that was, Mr. and Mrs. AIDS, and they would embody AIDS. And the villagers would talk to AIDS like it was a real person, like it was a character. And they would ask questions, like, why do you like our country so much? Or what effects do you have on our households and our communities? What keeps you strong? And they kind of interrogated the problem. And then after that, they brought out someone named Care, and Mr. or Mrs. Care. And they asked Care how to deal with this bully, this tyrant of AIDS. It's a powerful way, the arts is a powerful way to kind of externalize the problems that we face. And this is abundant in the arts. We talk about the protagonist and the antagonist. And the antagonist, their job is to keep the protagonist from getting what they want in their story. What happens a lot of the time is the villain or the antagonist, they embody the conflict that the protagonist is facing. So what narrative practices is trying to do is it's trying to provide the space for people in dealing with problems. Now, how does it do that? So a lot of therapy tends to focus on what are called structural ways of thinking and engaging with people. So this includes talking with people about, what are your needs, your motives, your attributes, traits, strengths, deficits, resources, properties, stuff like that. And that has its place, that has its time where we talk about that. Narrative practices tends to focus more on different things. Those are called, internal. What we tend to focus more on is the intentional, like what can you do, right? The thing about the internal things and the structuralist way of thinking is that they're focused on things that are innate in you, and they're things that can't really change, like StrengthsFinder, discover your strengths. Okay, great. Now that I've discovered my strengths, I just need to figure out how to best utilize them, And again, there's a place for all that stuff. But with narrative practices, and with stories in general, we're more focused on the intention of a character, the intention of a purpose. So these include purpose, values, beliefs, hopes, dreams, visions, commitments, what you want. When we go to a story, that tends to be more the stuff that's challenged in a story. We might think about a character's, strengths, but what we really want to see is how are they going to leverage those when the time comes. We're not interested in static characters. We're interested in dynamic characters. That's what intentions are really about, is like developing things that make us better, things that help us to live in a meaningful story. Our sense of purpose in life. We love to see a character's values getting challenged, or maybe they have to reassess what their values are in light of a different circumstances. Or what are they hoping for? What dream are they trying to bring about in the world? These intentions are ways that we can deal with problems because they're things that we can choose. Now, they're also influenced by narratives. They're not things that we just pull out of us. All these intentions are influenced by what we allow to influence us, or the things that are subtly and subconsciously influencing us. And so that's why it's important to be mindful of the narratives that you spend time in, the stories that you consume, so to speak. So how does this affect our day-to-day life in terms of people, seeing people as one thing. So if you see the person as the problem, so tell me if you've ever been here before. You're driving on the road and somebody cuts you off or they almost hit you and you go and you say, what the, or you give them the bird, the finger, or whatever you do in that moment. And you just get so irritated with them. And you go, man, that person's the problem with our society. Or you see a bunch of kids and you see them, causing mischief. Back in my day, kids would toilet paper people's houses. And you just be like, man, that's what's wrong with this society. That's what's wrong with this generation. And we point the finger and we say they're the problem. And instead of failing to recognize the multi-story nature of people. And that's one of the things we like to say here in All Things Narrative and in narrative practices in general is that people are multi-storied. What does that mean? It means that people are not just defined by one narrative, that people embody many narratives and there's endless possibilities within those narratives. So I remember, for example, being in a conversation with a group of people and they were talking about a very prolific figure, a very famous figure, influential. And there were people who said, oh, well, I know somebody who met this person and they said that they were kind of a jerk. And I knew other people were saying like, oh, but I heard he's such a great person and stuff like that. And we're having this conversation. And then somebody just, as we were talking, they just said, people really are multi-storied. And that really changed me, that moment, because it just made me realize that people are complicated. People are not just one thing. We might see one thing. We might have one interaction with a person and we see that one thing that we don't like, and that's our image of that person. You might think of your high school bully and you might just think, man, they were awful. I can't stand them. And we might be in therapy because of our high school bully. And you realize, why is somebody bullying? Where does that come from? What kind of hurt have they experienced in their life that has led them to that point where they're doing that? People are multi-storied. People are not just one thing, although it might be easy for us to classify them as one thing. Essentially, people being multi-storied means that they are complicated. And this includes the people that we don't always want to think of as complicated. So, as I mentioned, your high school bully is multi-storied. Your ex that you just can't stand to think about or be around is multi-storied. That family member that you've got beef with and that you just can't deal with at the dinner table around holidays, yeah, they're multi-storied too. Even that coworker that gossips about you or that boss you just don't like. And even the terrible people in history that we just don't like to talk about. Now, this does mean that people are complicated, but the thing is that if we're not careful, we can allow ourselves to be defined by a single story. So when we think of that really awful person in history that we just shudder at the thought of what they've done, they have allowed a single story to define who they are and how they're perceived. There's a multi-storied reality about that person, but the sad truth is that person has allowed themselves to become defined by one thing. So, like, have you ever seen the play Hamilton and you see at the end there, spoiler alert if you don't know history, but you see at the end there with Aaron Burr, and he talks about how, now he's the villain of your history. And we've spent this whole play learning more about him and the different stories that he's lived. But of course, since he's the one who killed Alexander Hamilton, that's all we know him as. And that's why choices matter and there's consequences for the stories that you live and how those stories define you. And that's why we also need to be so careful about the language that we use with people and the metaphors that we use. And this was hard for me in graduate school because I use a lot of metaphors when I talk about people. We all do, honestly. And I would just have people that would tell me, like, are you sure that's the way you want to engage with that person? So I think we like a lot of mechanical metaphors, for example, and we don't do it intentionally, this idea of talking about people like they're machines. But think about it. How many times have you ever said, like, oh, we just have to fix what's broken within that person? As if like they have a broken part and they're a machine and we just have to go in there and repair it and suddenly everything will magically be better. It's just why like I love these metaphors of sharing, people are on a journey. They're on a journey. This is where they're at on their journey right now. And the path that they're traveling down could potentially be dangerous. The path may be leading them to creating a hell in their lives. And so how do we help people navigate on their journey towards a path that's life-giving, fulfilling, that's like the embodiment of heaven and all that is good? So just being very conscious of the way we talk about people and talk with people as well, because we want to talk about people as they are people and problems as if they are problems. This language of externalizing problems, it's really funny because you could trace it back pretty far as well. And, I know a lot about Christianity and, because that's my religious background and context. And even within Christianity, there's language for this. So you can find internal language as well. And I'm sure if you're a Christian, you're probably thinking of verses right now. But there's a couple interesting verses here that I want to share. So like in Romans 7, Paul says, I do not understand my own actions. And tell me if this resonates with you if you've been there before, no matter what your belief system is. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Whew. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. Did you hear that? It is no longer I that do that. It is sin that dwells within me. Paul recognizes, and in the language of the Bible, there's this idea of what sin is, that sin is like this crouching beast. It's like this thing that consumes you. But it's, yes, in Christianity, there's language about sin being in your heart and stuff like that, and those things coming from your heart and coming from out of you. But again, we recognize that how do you encounter sin? How do you understand what it is? How does it grab a hold of you? And likewise, he also says in Ephesians chapter 6, and this is a great narrative practices thing. Like if you're Christian, you're interested in something with narrative practices in your context. This is a great example right here. It's in Ephesians chapter 6, and it says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. People are not the problem, but against the rulers, authorities, cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. I mean, there it is right there. Externalized language. Paul is saying, do not look at your brother or sister as the problem. Recognize that there is a larger conflict that they are caught up in. That's why Paul and other writers will say in different places, if you have someone that's your enemy, do good for them, because it's out of that goodness that maybe change can come about. And then Paul goes on to say here, therefore take up the whole armor of God so that you can withstand and stand firm. It's really beautiful image, because this idea of the armor of God is how am I going to deal with the problem? He talks about the belt and the shoes and all the different parts of this armor and the ways that these different things that you as a person have to make a choice every day to stand against the problem, to deal with the problem according to the ways that are best so that that problem does not rule over your life. Also in Buddhism, there's this idea in Buddhism. I don't know a lot about Buddhism, but I read this one time about how in Buddhism, something happens to you, and that thing that happens to you is not you itself. And that's very beautiful, the way they put that. And so I want to start to kind of wrap this up here. And if you have a problem in your life that you feel like it's crushing you, it's affecting your movement and the journey that you're on and the story that you find yourself in, then I encourage you to reach out to me, allthingsnarrative.com, and get a free consultation for one-on-one life coaching, where we can we can better understand the problem. That's kind of the first piece of it. Is I ask a lot of questions about the problem and the history of the problem and understanding the context of it, and then let's together kind of journey through. Okay, so if we view our lives as stories and this problem, how are we going to renegotiate our relationship with this problem? How are we going to ultimately overcome this? So that's the work that we try to do. And we do that in one-on-one coaching. We also do that in our workshop, Live a Meaningful Story. And if you want any information on that, you have any questions at all my consultations are free for 15 minutes. And then after that, we decide, what kind of plan might be best that we can go off in terms of payment and all that stuff. But yeah, so go to reach out to me at allthingsnarrative.com and email me, contact me there. And yeah, let's journey through this, because you out there, listener, we live in a world where you could be told constantly that you are the problem. But I just want to urge you with I wish I could just give you a hug and tell you that you are not the problem. The problem is the problem. And the saddest thing for me to see is when people allow problems to define their lives. And this understanding that our lives and that you as a person, that you are multi-storied. Oh, that is so key to how we navigate the journeys that we're on. If we have a conversation, we'll see that there's an alternative narrative that's there, a preferred narrative that can help us to deal with these problems. And so that's what we want to do, is I want to empower you to live a meaningful story. So thank you so much for joining me for this Narrative 101. And we will be back next week for our Why We Love Star Wars episode. And that's another great example of externalized language. And we'll talk about Darth Vader. That's a great illustration of all this too. And yeah, we'll chop it up with Joe and Jason and another guy, Nick, as well. So it's going to be fantastic. So thank you so much for checking this out. This is your friendly narrative practitioner, Derek, signing off. So long and take care.